Good morning, and thanks for inviting us to share some information on the placement of transmission facilities within state highway corridors, and in particular WSDOT policies that'll be important to be aware of as state highways are considered as opportunities to help meet clean energy goals. So I'll be co-presenting with WSDOT's environmental policy manager, Justin Zweifel, who's going to highlight some of the great work that we're doing with respect to our focus on sustainability and resilience. And then I'm going to provide an overview of policies related to occupancy of state highway properties for other than transportation purposes. This session is billed as challenges, and that characterization is understandable from the perspective that transportation corridors might be readily available for siting solutions. But our goal is to provide some relevant facts for awareness and also to set the stage for opportunities. Next slide, please. And Justin, over to you to kick us off.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to apologize for my scratchy voice this morning. Everyone in my house has been battling a cold this week, but I'm feeling fine, but my throat's a little bit rough. So please jump in and let me know if you're having any trouble hearing me this morning. But anyways, I'm Justin Zweifel, and I'm WSDOT's NEPA-SEPA program manager. I'm sure that most of or all of you are familiar with those acronyms, but just in case, NEPA and SEPA are national and state environmental policy acts. And my program works to develop and maintain agency policies and procedures for complying with NEPA and SEPA and the associated environmental laws and regulations that sort of fall under the NEPA and SEPA umbrellas. This is my first transmission corridor working group meeting, and I'm serving as the alternate to Ahmer. So looking at this slide here, just briefly, I wanted to get us started today by discussing sustainability as one of WSDOT's values. So we have a strategic plan which establishes our agency values and agency goals. The agency goals are the three big circles there. And then, we have our agency values, which are the ones that are going around the outside, and that includes sustainability. These serve as our guiding principles and represent how WSDOT does business. So that we can make sure that Washington travelers have a safe and sustainable multimodal system. Can you go to the next slide, please, Amir? So how is WSDOT implementing its sustainability value? But basically on this slide, this shows some of our actions and initiatives toward achieving sustainability and the use of our assets, including considerations for climate change and reduced emissions. We strive to protect the natural environment and our communities and, of course, cultural resources. As environmental stewards, we're also doing what we can to promote orca and salmon recovery through our fish passage projects and programs and stormwater treatment. So really a lot of good stuff that we're working on, as an agency for both the human and the natural environment, and to make sure that we're maintaining that, sustainable transportation system. We also have a Secretary's Executive Order on sustainability signed by WSDOT Secretary Roger Millar that directs WSDOT staff to take actions that promote sustainability through a focus on energy efficiency, pollution reduction, and enhanced resilience. But yeah, so those are some of our key, WSDOT sustainability initiatives. And now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to my friend Amir to talk about policies for siting in the WSDOT right away.
Thank you, Justin. And we thought it would be important to provide that big picture. And so the remainder of the presentation is going to address locating facilities within WSDOT-owned properties. And as some of our industry partners here are well aware, it's not always a simple or straightforward process because the rules and procedures vary according to types of properties and highways. And I'll summarize some of the standard terms and conditions for occupancy of WSDOT properties and then make my way to setting the stage for some potential opportunities. Next slide, please. The WSDOT properties aren't limited to operating highway corridors, but they include non-highway properties as well that are referred to as sundry sites. And those include pit, quarry sites, park and ride lots, ferry terminals, airport properties, and mitigation sites that are not contiguous with a highway corridor. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I have a simplified summary of facility types that are typically accommodated within WSDOT properties. These are divided here between utility type facilities and other non-utility facilities. Within the utilities category, there's also a distinction between crossings and longitudinal installations, meaning that they're running parallel along the highway alignment. The rows indicate the legal instrument used to authorize the facilities, and you can note that each type of instrument is prescribed by statute. And also included are associated costs and some notes on approvals. So in the case of a utility crossing, these installations are usually authorized as long as standard design requirements such as depth, height, and offset from the traveled way can be achieved. For longitudinal placement, that involves greater scrutiny because they create additional risk in terms of safety, operations, and long-term preservation of the corridor for highway purposes. Also, in the case of longitudinal placement, higher levels of approval are necessary and require demonstrating that other reasonable alternatives aren't available. In the non-utility category, those facilities are accommodated through leases as prescribed under statute. As far as cost for utility installation, WSDOT is only authorized to recover the administrative costs of investigating and administering permits and franchises. With leases, the difference is that fair market rent has to be a condition of occupancy. Next slide, please. The classification of highways also comes into play here. Generally speaking, there are two state highway designations, and these are different than functional classifications that you might be familiar with, like arterial, collector, distributor road classifications. This has more to do with property ownership and controlling access to and from the highway. For our purpose here, you can think of limited access highways as those where access is controlled through on and off ramps, and managed access roads as highways that include at-grade intersections and driveways. It's a little more complicated than that, but as I said, for our purposes here, I think that's going to be sufficient. Limited access designations aren't limited to just the operating corridors, but they usually extend for some distance out from the highway lanes and oftentimes even hundreds of feet down local roadways at highway interchanges. And so, as you can imagine, the bar is higher for proposals that involve limited access highways. That means more scrutiny, more justification, higher levels of approvals, and including Federal Highway Administration approvals for interstate corridors. And so here's a bit of a curveball regarding managed access highways. Under state law, property ownership for managed access highways located within the incorporated limits of cities vests with that city. So in those instances, the cities have exclusive authority to grant utility franchises along those highway segments. So the city is the permitting authority there in those cases and not WSDOT. Next slide, please. So I mentioned previously that WSDOT considers applications for new facilities with respect to certain requirements and principles. And to elaborate, any third-party occupancy of the right-of-way carries risk related to safety and operations, including how the facilities are designed and located, construction activities, and continuing access needs for maintenance. So our design requirements for utilities are contained in the WAC, and they address things like depth, height, restrictions having to do with scenic classification. So that means restrictions on aerial facilities where approval would impair a scenic value at a particular location. There are different design requirements for various utility types. For example, encasement requirements don't apply to electric transmission facilities where they do for lines transmitting hazardous liquids. In any case, design and placement requirements in the WAC generally need to be met along with applicable industry standards. One of the most common issues with electrical power facilities is the need to meet clear zone requirements, and that's the distance from the traveled way that any above ground facility needs to be to provide a recoverable area for errant vehicles. And then there's also the need to address preservation. Highway rights-of-way are acquired using motor vehicle funds, and the primary use of the right-of-way must be maintained as a transportation corridor. That has strong connection with case law related to the 18th Amendment to the state constitution. And under state law, any utilities occupying state highway rights-of-way are subject to relocation at the utility's cost whenever required for a highway purpose. Next slide, please. So this slide gives you an idea of the general provisions contained in our permit and franchise documents. I'm using the terms permit and franchise, and previously I mentioned that permits are associated with crossings and franchises with more substantial installations. The only substantive difference between the two is that permits don't have a term where franchises carry a term of typically 25 years. We already went over design and relocation requirements, so I'm not going to dwell on those. If a facility within limited access corridor requires regular or periodic access for maintenance or inspection, an additional approval is required in the form of an access break. So any access points outside of the lanes of travel or shoulders is strictly controlled. Next slide, please. I'll just mention briefly here for the sake of time that siting within non-highway properties is done through leases. They require the payment of fair market rent that's based on appraised land value and otherwise very similar to permits and franchises in terms of being revocable and requiring location when necessary for a high purpose. In these cases, we don't have the same conflict with highway safety, operational needs, but the important thing here is that the functional purpose for which the land was acquired needs to be preserved. Next slide, please. So here I wanted to share a parallel effort that could, I think, very well inform discussions on clean energy facilities along highways. So as you are probably aware, Washington is very aggressively working to meet state broadband goals that are going to address gaps in service to communities across the state. There were several bills that were passed last session to this effect, including the expanded use of state highway corridors to help deploy broadband infrastructure. Some of the things that are developing as a result are innovative partnering with industry, a dig once policy where broadband infrastructure owners will have opportunities to plan and install facilities concurrently with highway projects. I have a note at the top that all of the same factors apply as far as the mechanisms and requirements and restrictions for locating within highway properties. The difference is that WSDOT both has an interest in expanding its own fiber networks and are also willing partners in achieving state broadband goals. Therefore, policies are being developed that essentially create flexibilities for broadband facilities where there is a clear connection to meeting state goals and where the state can benefit through expansion of its transportation-related fiber networks. Next slide, please. Considering what's happening with respect to the broadband goals, again, where we seek mutually beneficial partnerships, what opportunities exist along similar lines with clean energy goals? So I want to make clear here that this slide is strictly a brainstorm of ideas based on a brief conversation I had with our Director of Innovative Partnerships. They're not being put out as proposals at this point, but just to demonstrate areas of possible mutual benefit. So I've listed here completion of the electric vehicle charging network. We are currently endeavoring to map gaps in what could be a comprehensive charging network. So something like that could certainly help to identify opportunities to work together. The same with WSDOT ferries electrification, which involves a phased approach to achieving emission reduction goals. We know that other states have allowed solar generation facilities within portions of their DOT rights of way. It would be interesting to understand how they went about those types of authorizations. Another idea might involve co-location with broadband infrastructure. So this final slide is really an acknowledgement that WSDOT is willing to think through new and innovative ideas that come from industry and public partners that might introduce new ways of thinking about transmission facilities within highway corridors and other WSDOT owned properties. Last slide, please, which brings us to our thanks for your time this morning. And at this point, I'm happy to at least try to answer any questions.
Great, Ahmer, Justin, thank you. So do folks have any questions? I want to make sure to make space for folks to ask any questions. We didn't have any that came in through the chat. And so I'm going to ask folks to please jump in. Questions. Glenn, you turned your camera on. I don't know if that means you have a question. Nope. Okay. So question for you in the chat is, are you tracking what other states such as in the upper Midwest are doing with regard to installation of underground high voltage transmission lines along interstate highway rights of ways?
Not exactly with respect to that region. We work with AASHTO, which is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Organizations or officials, sorry. And so that's sort of the group of state DOTs that would discuss various things, including these types of questions. We haven't, but I will certainly work with our utilities engineer to reach out to find more information.
Great. Thank you, Amir. Folks have any other questions?
Well, thank you very much for your time and the opportunity.
Perfect.
Amir, I just would like to say, this is Kathleen, really appreciate the presentation. And for me, for example, I'm thinking about how do we shape recommendations, because it seems like in this instance, we have a lot more work to do. But maybe that's how we shape something going forward, or we have some opportunities to talk more about in the coming meetings.
Sure, and my suggestion would be something along the lines of taking cues from what's transpiring with what I described as far as broadband, and seeing what similar types of opportunities are available there. Because I mean, it's the same general scenario where we have, as I mentioned, the same restrictions apply with broadband, but then there's this overarching state goal that WSDOT's a willing participant in. So where can we find opportunities that scenario?
Great, thank you, Amir. We had one question come in via the chat. Is what internal policies do you have about working on tribal land?
Justin, would you step in there?
Hi, yeah, can everybody hear me okay right now?
Yeah.
Okay, thumbs up. Okay, good. Well, from an environmental perspective, we have a WSDOT environmental manual, and Chapter 530 is our chapter on tribal approvals. So that's our policy, and so we have that in place that talks about how we work with tribes. It goes through treaty rights, Section 106 consultation, permits that are needed, and various tribal laws. So that's the main place to look for when we do our environmental reviews related to work on tribal lands. I don't know if there's anything specifically in the utility accommodation manual, but I would guess it probably points to that environmental manual, Chapter 530, as well.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, and I can send you a copy of that, Don.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Amir. Thank you, Don, for asking the question. Next question here is, as highways are widened over time, do you try to permit longitudinal lines at the far edges of the right-of-way to reduce relocations over time?
Absolutely, yeah. That's I guess what you can call sort of an aspirational element in policy. It's more than policy. It's stated in the WAC that facilities are to be placed as far out from the traveled way as possible for that purpose.